everyone, to the inaugural episode of the Country House podcast. And as a way to get things kicked off, let's introduce ourselves. I'll start with myself. I'm Ben Hancock. I'm a country house enthusiast, you would say. I'm no way as qualified as these other two chaps to talk about country houses, but I do love them and have a passion for them. And that started for me. I worked with the world-renowned country house painter Jonathan Miles Lee, and until the day of his passing, and he instilled in me a great love and respect and admiration for country houses. And so I see this in a way for myself as carrying on that legacy that was his and is so important. And you'll get to know me more as we go on, but Connor and Jeff, who wants to go first in introducing yourself?
I'm Connor Lynch. I am also a country house enthusiast, and I'm looking at country houses from an architectural viewpoint. So restoration and design of new houses, but also the ancillary buildings, outbuildings, follies, gate lodges, everything architectural you can think of on an estate. And I've had a passion for country houses since a very young age.
Why did you have that passion? What brought about that initial passion?
Well, I suppose from a young age, from a time I can't remember, being in country houses, on old estates, surrounded by beautiful old oak and chestnut, and then the houses themselves had so much character, unlike any other house, that they are family homes, and you can feel that in the architecture. But we can talk about that after we've heard Jeff's introduction.
Yeah, and Jeff Heath Taylor.
Yeah, thanks, Connor and Ben. My name is Jeffrey Heath Taylor. I'm an architectural historian and writer. I'm also a country house enthusiast, as like both of you. I worked for Country Life magazine for a couple of years, writing about architectural history and country houses. I've subsequently been a freelance contributor for a number of publications, writing about country houses and their collections, their architecture, their interiors. I would say, for me, my love of country houses, I don't quite know where I got it from. It was instilled in me from a very young age, not necessarily by my parents. We'd visit the occasional country house, but tend to just go into the garden. I was always obsessed with the house. My parents loved the gardens. I think I was born with this strange love of country houses. I remember when I was about 6 years old, etching onto the underside of my family dining table my dream country house, and getting in lots of trouble from my parents for doing so. And indeed, even when I was sort of 8 or 9, I was spending my pocket money on Country Life magazine, where most of my friends were buying the Beano and sweets, just because I love the architectural pages. So, yeah, it's a funny one. It was definitely something I was born with, not learnt. But yeah, I greatly love all aspects of the country house, from the architecture and the interiors and the collections through to their role in society, and particularly village life.
Yeah, that's a topic that we'll definitely delve into, and I'm excited about learning more with the social side of country houses. But there aren't many country house podcasts out there. In fact, specifically, not really any majorly at all. And so that might beg the question from some people who are tuning in of, why is there a need to talk about country houses? Why are they important? I wonder, Connor, if you could shed some light on that.
Well, I suppose country houses, unlike towns and cities, which are forever changing, country houses can be a foot in a deeper past, but also, if the family who built the house many hundreds of years ago are still there, the architecture has adapted and changed with the family's adaptation and changing throughout the centuries. So a country house offers you a look into the past that a town and city cannot offer, I think.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that they are still relevant in today's society, or?
I think absolutely. And the fact that so many were demolished in the 20th century, they're even more relevant and more important now, because we have less in this century than we did at the beginning of the last century. and you can't build a new old house. There are new country houses being built, but of those that are old and still live on, I think they are very important. And the crowds of people who flock to those that are, say, National Trust or Historic House Association, it shows you they are as popular as ever. And with Downton Abbey and many country house films, they form part of the backdrop to our popular culture.
What do you think people? Well, either I know Jeff, you know a lot of English country house owners. What do people misunderstand about modern country house living?
That's a good question, Ben. I think that the hardest thing is the politics of envy and people um, who see country house owners as people of great privilege who aren't in touch with society in general. And actually, from my experience, especially the country house owners who have been in their homes for centuries, who have looked after them, they see themselves as stewards and custodians, not as owners. And more than that, the role that country house owners played in village life was such that they, the concept of noblesse oblige has been somewhat diluted in recent years, but they had a real sense of, and most country house owners I know still have a real sense um, of stewardship, of looking out for those less fortunate than themselves. A lot of these families, they're not wealthy, they're asset rich and cash poor. A lot of them have buckets in their drawing rooms and flaking windowsills and all sorts of other things. Yet they will open their house up for village events, for community events. I've rarely met a country house owner who doesn't understand um, poverty in a way that a lot of city dwelling, I dare I say it, sort of city dwelling middle classes don't, because although they don't see or they don't engage with uh, people in the same way. I guess what I'm trying to say is they, the role of the sort of squire in a country house is that he listens to the concerns of all the people around him. So he will hear the plights of villagers in his community, who are struggling to get by. I think of houses I know where they own villages and they give vastly discounted rent and leases to families who can't afford to pay the market rents, and that's something which modern day landlords don't get. Modern day landlords are sort of about quick profit, and I think that's the key thing. I suppose is the long term approach that country house owners have. If you've owned a country house for 500 years, you're stewarding it for the next 500 years. So you want the right people, the people who on your estate, rather than just the people who will pay the most. You want a mix of people as well. And so I think the country house owners role in society is more important now than ever, because it's a concept of community and giving, and it's really interesting the number of country house owners I know who take a much longer term perspective on things like the economy and politics. It's interesting that so many country house owners and indeed landowners took a very different perspective to cities over a number of big political issues in recent years, because they're thinking in terms of centuries, not decades or years. And that's something which we're very fortunate to engage with people like that, who are thinking in terms of that. So yeah, I think that's the main thing that I think country house owners have is a long term perspective that transcends the sort of peaks and troughs of the present day, and it's very hard for us, I think, to grasp that, because we think, especially people our sort of age, in our sort of circles, will often engage with will often thinks in terms of that, the next quick profit, the next salary, the next election, the next whatever, and actually country house owners can take a much longer term perspective, which is something we can all learn from.
And just following on from what Jeff has said, that when the family have been on that particular estate for many centuries, the tenants and those who work on the estate or live in the village may have also been there for many generations, and you will find the farmer, the gamekeeper, is fifth, sixth, seventh generation gamekeeper, farmer, whatever it might be. And with an ancestral land as such, there is a sense of duty then to the maintenance, the upkeep, and the passing on to the next generation, to give as you have received. And I think that bears strongly on the behavior towards looking after the estate and the house, that there is this sense of responsibility to those that have come before and those that will inherit the property.
I think that's a really good point about the stewardship. And it seems to, as you were alluding to, Jeff, as well, the community side of it, there seems to be a track record as far back as you look in history as they've existed, that there is an outpouring of community and giving in the country house world. Even looking at, as you both know, faith is very important to me, and I'm quite a religious man, and I admire how even back in the 1500s, when Elizabeth I was on the throne, and how the Catholics struggled to have masses, and many of those masses had to be, well, their only option to actually hear mass was to visit the homes of nobility and gentry and go into the chapels that were built and maintained by the estate. And those were the people who had influence enough where Elizabeth I would sort of allow them, was content for them to practice Catholicism, but other people in the community couldn't. And so you wonder what the landscape of our society would be today, not just in faith, but in so many other aspects, if it weren't for that community sense of responsibility and sense of stewardship that came from those estates, which seems the antithesis to what people look at it from on a surface point level of, oh, it must be full of greed, it must be full of profit, as you said, and power.
Yeah, and I think also you're right. I mean, society's changed a lot. It's interesting you touched on the religious aspect. Of course, that was hugely tied up with, of course, the fact that parish church, every parish tends to have, or tended to have, a country house and a squire, as well as a village church. And the you know, I it's so sad to think now with the decline in church going in this country, that was a wonderful place where, yes, okay, the squire might have sat on in his own, special pew or something like that, but it was a place where everyone was leveled. It was a great leveler in society, because whether you were, a duke or a marquis sitting on the front row, or the coal miner's son sitting on the back row, you're all in the same room under under God. I think back to I know it's a slight tangent, but that wonderful quote that Queen Victoria famously said when she met Charles Spurgeon, the great Reformed pastor in the 19th century, and Charles Spurgeon had talked to her about the rapture and the return of Christ, and Queen Victoria said, "I so wish, Mr. Spurgeon, that Christ would return in my lifetime." And Spurgeon goes, "Why is that?" And she said, "So I can lay the crown of Britain and the empire at his feet." And it's that sense of religion being tied in with society and with country houses, especially, and the class system that actually, again, it's going back to stewardship and noblesse oblige, that actually people who are born into privilege have a duty to support those less fortunate than themselves, and that's something that's changing in a lot of areas of society. We're becoming a far more self-centered society and individualistic society. But if you go to rural estates and country houses, you see a glimmer of sort of hope that there are still people out there who take that sense of duty and corporate responsibility seriously.
As a fruit of that, have any of you ever read the very niche poetry genre of country house poetry?
Please share your favorite poem.
Patron's poetry. I just think, continuing on stewardship, it shows what we think, that there was a huge divide between people in the community and the country house. But you read country house poetry, and it's these long poems. I think, I can't remember the name of the earliest one. It's sort of, they always have the name. I'll send it to you, and people listening, just look up country house poetry and you'll see. But it is always an ode to the patron, because the patron was so generous, and we don't talk about this, but the patron was so generous and so giving in the community, that when a patron passed away or a country house was out of use, you'd have these long winding odes to them. And it's amazing, and they describe the beauty of the gardens and relating them to the generosity of the patron, and describing the patron's dogs or whatever. It's a really beautiful genre, but it goes back to that real view of such how important that role of the country house was in the community. I mean, Chatsworth at one point hired 40 staff for the house, including 2 full-time window cleaners. So you see just how intertwined they were. I'll send you both.
It's probably worth caveating what you just said, of course, Ben, by saying that, of course, there are stories of landowners and squires who weren't quite so magnanimous. Connor probably can tell us better stories, because on Ireland, for every landlord who treated his the people who worked for him with disdain, for example, during the Irish potato famine, there were other landlords who treated them incredibly kindly. And it was interesting when the great burn. Connor, you can probably talk about this more, but when they were burning country houses in Ireland in the early 20th century, a number, for every house that was burnt down because they treated their staff badly, there was a country house that was saved because the staff lined up outside and stopped them from burning it down. Is that right, Connor?
Yes, there are examples of houses where you had these guerrilla gangs that would go around the country burning out houses. And this is 1919, 1920, 21. And one such house, Castleburgh, which is a magnificent house if it was around today. The shell of it exists. But back to the poetry, there's a poem about this particular estate where, when it was burnt out, that a local poem was written about the tenants didn't realize they had heaven on earth until the estate had disappeared, until it was gone. And you can see from the plans and from old photographs, it was beautifully laid out and all that. But yes, in Ireland, there were a minority of absentee landlords, particularly in the west of Ireland, where you had an estate manager who learnt his discipline, I suppose, abroad, and he brought back some of the poor practices which he learnt abroad to the west of Ireland, and he didn't treat the tenants correctly, and there were evictions where on another estate where the family would have been, they would have come to an arrangement, and that on a small island where it travels fast, and of course then it fanned the flames of the anti-country house, I suppose, movements, which was formed by these guerrilla gangs. There was one such house, Summer Hill, which is an early Georgian Palladian country house. And the story was that the owner was in England on business or on a trip, and this gang was coming up the long drive avenue to the house, which could be seen from the front door. And the butler's description was that he could see the torches, the firelit torches, getting closer and closer. And him and a few maids, a small amount of staff in the house, exited through the back door, ran across the fields, and looked back to a house in flames. And there were many such cases where these gangs may have turned up to a house. The family was told, you have 10 minutes to leave. They could maybe just take a few belongings, if anything, some sentimentals, and they sit on the front lawn and watch their house, their belongings, their home go up in flames. And yes, of course, there are then many examples of houses where locals, particularly those on the estate, prevented it happening. I think one such house was Castletown in Kildare, where the local people joined locked arms at the gate and wouldn't allow this guerrilla gang through. But of course, many houses weren't so fortunate.
Gosh. Well, thanks for bringing that point up, Jeff. I think that's really interesting, and we'll have to do a whole episode dedicated to the anti-country house movement and the negative relationships that were experienced too, for balance. But Connor, could you give us an introduction? Obviously, we can't cover it all in this the time that we have today, but maybe some key principles of, from an architectural standpoint, of the country house.
I would say that for the most part, when people think of, I'd be describing now what when people think of a country house today, when they're thinking of the house in the parkland and on the estate as such. A country house is not built and designed in isolation as an architectural piece. It is a marriage with the landscape and the planting of trees, the approach of the drive, the placement of that drive, and the gate lodges is an important part of the architectural composition. And a house that comes to mind is Trafalgar House in Wiltshire, where the house is on a hill, and upon entering through the gate lodge, you get a glimpse of the house in the distance. So you see it for a split moment, and then you disappear back into trees. It crosses the avenue again, and you can see the house a lot closer this time. But once again, you descend into the trees. You're descending the hill, well, slight slope, but you can't see the house. And it's not until the final approach, swinging around to the house, that you can see it in its full glory, coming in at 45 degrees. And that was all on purpose to build anticipation and think of it as a trailer, an advert for a film, where they give you glimpses of the film and to entice you to see the feature. And in a way, an approach to a country house acts in a similar way. The country house itself, thinking of a typical Georgian Palladian country house, where you have a flight of steps, perhaps maybe even 3 steps to a front door, which opens into an entrance hall, usually double height. Of course, not always, but on a grand house, which visiting National Trust people familiar with, these have stately rooms, which were designed for visitors from day one. And those houses, these grand houses such as Chatsworth, would allow for a more private family setting and a more public, stately setting. Now, the smaller country houses, which are still grand, but not as grand as Chatsworth, those which are open to the public now, the interaction between public and private is more difficult because, of course, those houses, the entire house was a private home. And with a country house, you will find that the placement of the rooms, the breakfast room, the saloon, the drawing room, the library, they are laid out in such a way that you process through the house over the course of the day, and depending on the activity of these rooms, they'll be placed according to roughly what time of the day you might find yourself in there. So in the morning, the rising sun in the east, and of course then the library, you don't want direct sunlight, and perhaps northern light in the library, a consistent light. And then of course upstairs, the bedrooms. Some houses make a feature of the stairs, and some houses will put the stairs off to a side, and it's not as important. But you will often see that the stairs is an architectural statement, and that, of course, is because in the times before the car, traveling to a house would mean an overnight or a week-long or weekend stay, and so the entertainment, what the visitor saw, did not stop on the ground floor. It ascended the stairs, and then you'd have the same amount of decoration in some of the key bedrooms. Country houses are not only homes, but first and foremost, thinking prior to the 18th century, fortifications, a place where the local authority, the noble family, um, the feudal estate, uh, was it was a keep. It was protecting itself from external forces if there were tribes or warfare. But into the late 17th century, when things became more peaceful, they went more as status symbols in terms of the decoration and how elaborate they were. And from through the ages, the fashions, of course, changes, and you will have a Tudor house, which will have then a Georgian face, and then maybe in the 1860s, 1880s, they put on a Gothic face, and so a house does change as the taste can change, and of course that comes with cost, and sometimes houses, particularly in the Victorian era, got so big that with the declining income of an estate, the future, the descendants, those who inherited the estate, could not afford to keep such a large house. But those of a more manageable size, they weathered the storms of the 20th century better. And when I say those storms, I mean the death duties and all the taxation placed on the country house in the 20th century. Now, the most damning statistic, I think, of that period was in 1955, one house was demolished every 5 days. And this is not just a large manor house, farmhouse. This is a stately home. This is a grand country house of significant interest was demolished every 5 days. And it's at that time that people started to sit up and say, we have to do something.
That is an incredible statistic. One house every 5 days.
In 1955, shocking.
Well, I think that segment leads us nicely onto something before we close, which is a bit lighter, of favourite country house and why. And I'll share mine first. Kedleston Hall, Derbyshire. Visited there with my wife, home of the great film The Duchess. And I was the whole house is a showpiece when you go in. It's unbelievable, especially the marble hall, which was definitely the highlight for me. It was designed to look by Robert Adams, I think the architect's name is, or Adam Roberts, I can't remember. Robert Adams. They wanted this hall to look like an ancient Roman atrium, or reflect architecture of ancient Greece. They had the Corinthian toppers on the columns, and these grand columns made of Derbyshire alabaster. It's sort of got this pink look to it, and it looks out onto the green outside, and it was just stunning. And that was one of those moments for me where I thought, I've got to visit these places more often. It was such a amazing experience for me. Anyway, that's mine. What about yours, Jeff?
Yeah, so I mean, there are so many; it's hard to choose. I could go for one of the grand houses, the likes of Castle Howard, which featured in Brideshead Revisited, or Holcombe Hall in Norfolk, which is one of the great Palladian houses of England with extraordinary neoclassical or classical interiors. But I think for me, what I've got a great love of is sort of the smaller country house, but still substantial, I suppose. The sort of you could say sort of pocket-sized stately home, you might say. So my favourite house is a house called Chettle House in Dorset, which is an English Baroque country house, red brick with stone dressings. It was built by Thomas Archer, or designed by Thomas Archer, the famous English Baroque architect who designed St John Smith Square, for those listeners who know, the church, now music venue in Westminster. Wonderful English Baroque architect. And this house, what's so exquisite about Chettle that I love is, I love it for many reasons. I love the architecture, of course. It's very grand, almost ostentatious English Baroque. Yet the house itself is not too large. It's not on the scale of Blenheim or Castle Howard by any means. It's very much a pocket-sized country house. It's got exquisite curved edges, which is quite unusual. It's quite Baroque, but it's quite unusual. Those curved edges are actually added later. Pevsner, the great sort of traveller and country house writer, described Chettle House as the plum among Dorset houses of the early 18th century, and an even nationally outstanding as a specimen of English Baroque. And what I love about Chettle, it was owned by the same family for centuries, and actually went on the market for the first time in its history, or since the present house was built, in 2015. And I actually wrote about that sale for Country Life back in 2015. It's a house I discovered when I was quite young. Candida Lycett Green, John Betjeman's daughter, who was a contributor to the Oldie magazine, she used to do a weekly column or monthly column in the Oldie called Unwrecked England. And she described Chettle, the village of Chettle, back in the early 2000s when I was about 10 years old. I read about this extraordinary village in Dorset. That the entire village was owned by one family. And they ran it almost as a feudal system in the 21st century, with, offering, again, like I mentioned earlier, offering very good rates and rents to families who had been in situ for generations. There was a village shop, a village pub. And wonderfully, that village still belongs to the family who built Chettle. They sold the house on a couple of hundred acres in 2015, but the family still own the village and protect it and preserve it. And, I'll give an interesting fact. If you look at the most unwrecked and most beautiful counties in England we think of, the reason they're so unwrecked and so beautiful is because they're still privately owned. Dorset, for example, is almost entirely owned by a handful of landowners, and it's the only county in England without a motorway, for example. So it's really interesting, and for me, Chettle, what I love is it was restored by an architect who I'm friends with and an interior designer who I'm friends with, and it was bought by a family who I know who have links to the local area, who are great stewards and custodians, and have very much the old school mindset of what it means to own a country house, even though they only bought it recently. For me, Chettle is special not just for its exquisite architecture and recently exquisite interiors, but because of how it still plays such an important role in local village life, and that's why I love Chettle so much. Connor, what about you?
Well, I do agree that the countryside in general, of the parts of the country that are the most beautiful, and rolling hills of different shades of green and hedgerow and forest and patches of woodland, that is because of the country estate. If this was just small holdings, you wouldn't find the amount of forest and woodland that you see for, say, pheasant or cover for other game. This is all part of the estate. That this is land which is not being cultivated. Whereas if it was a small holding, of course, you'd be every square inch you'd be trying to get an income from that. So the country estate is not only about the house and its direct parkland, but as Jeff says, it's the village and it's the people. Something that a lot of people miss with the country estate is that first and foremost, it is the people, it is the families and the family, and take them away, and you really do take the heart and soul out of the village, out of the country house. A lot of the houses which don't have their old family in them now, that might be National Trust. Thankfully, these houses are saved and people can visit them, but without the family there, they are missing something important to them. These houses are the architectural representation of that family. This is that family manifest, and it has changed with the family. And you'll often see that the approach of conservation today is where wallpaper has to be preserved at all costs, or the most mundane thing you find in a house, which will be worn and torn with family life, with kids running around. And a house is to be lived in. And country house owners, which, for example, may get a grant to fix the roof or repair windows, a caveat will come with that grant where you can no longer make full changes to the house. It's not fully yours to sort of change. Now the house may be saved, and that's great if you didn't have the cash to repair the roof. But if you don't accept it, then you're more free to keep the house going in the tradition it has been for the last few hundred years, however long the family's been there. And one house in particular, which some people may remember, there was a Channel 4 documentary many years ago, Francis Fulford appeared on, and Great Fulford in Devon. And he was talking about the nation's interest in this house. And he said, the only time people came to my house previously was with cannons to try and get my family out of here, talking of the Civil War. And he said when he was offered a grant to make some repairs, it was at that point, he said, he investigated what are the strings attached, and he realized that he wouldn't be able to make a lot of calls on significant architectural elements of the house following that. So he said he has taken no grants, but at least the house is fully his in the real sense of it continues to adapt and change with the family's needs.
It's really interesting, Connor. I think it's probably also worth saying, just going back to my comment earlier about the custodian nature and the long-term thinking. And we could do another episode on sort of London estates. But something I've noticed, having lived on 2 London estates, family-owned estates, is again, if you walk through Marylebone, for example, which is largely owned by 2 estates, Portman and the Howard de Walden estates, 2 grand families, you can tell which houses belongs to private landlords and which ones belong to these estates, because the estates believe in placemaking. You know, Grosvenor, for example, has made huge progress in creating pedestrianised streets. You know, Cadogan's currently pedestrianising part of Sloane Avenue or Sloane Street, and what they do is they take a long-term perspective. So if you walk through Marylebone, like I said, all the houses that are well kept with well painted front doors and railings and stucco that's recently been re-rendered and you know, box hedging that's not dead, you'll find that more often than not those houses belong to family estates who have owned these houses since they were built and will own them until hopefully they last into posterity. And actually those houses are better maintained because the families have a long-term perspective. Whereas if you're a landowner, if you own a couple of townhouses and you want to make a quick profit, then you're not incentivized to invest in the same way. I live in Chelsea now, and you walk down the King's Road and you can tell at what point the Cadogan estate ends and private landowners start because of the type of shops on the King's Road. You know, the nice shops, the shops that are placemaking, you know, that around Duke of York Square, for example, you have a mix of high end and low end restaurants, but the facades are all well kept. The planting is all alive, you know, whereas you walk further down, you know, past Marks and Spencer's or whatever, and you see the road gradually deteriorate in quality, aesthetic quality as we move away from the family estate into private landlords. And it's just something to bear in mind. Again, that long-term perspective is so important in the country estate, in the sense of placemaking and community making. So that's just another thought. I'd love to do an episode in due course on the London estates, because there's such an interesting aspect to landed estates, that there are still, you know, large swathes of London are still privately owned by a handful of families.
And even when you go into my territory, which is all the way up north, I was recently in the village estate that family estate owned. Lord and Lady Chatburn own the village of Chatburn, very small village, but they decided, one example, they put the electricity lines underground to preserve the look of the placemaking of the village, and it really does make a difference. It's stunning there. But our time is near ending. Briefly, Connor, tell us your favourite country house.
Well, I was just going to follow on from what Jeff said, exactly with the short-term versus long-term thinking makes such a difference in terms of the places we find ourselves, the physical world. In London, when you step onto these estates within London, you will notice a great improvement to street furniture, to pavement surface using stone, and the environs are just they are built for the long term with an aesthetic consideration that a short-term owner would not see the point of, probably.
Favorite country house, Connor? Tell us in a nutshell.
God, well, favorite country house in terms of, I think Trafalgar House, which I mentioned earlier, but a house I've yet to visit, which I think is one of the most important houses in the country, is Wentworth Woodhouse. It's a sentinel in the landscape. It's, I think, the most rooms, the largest country house in the country. And I saw it first in Dan Cruikshank's. He had a series called The Country House Revealed, and I think it was episode 5. You can find it on YouTube, and it is the best episode I've ever seen on a country house. The music, the filmography, the interviews. It's. I highly recommend listeners to watch The Country House Revealed.
Brilliant. Well, I need to go to Wentworth Woodhouse myself because I'm not even that far away from it. So I must go. And, well, thank you to our listeners for joining us for this first episode, which has been quite general, more of an introduction overview, but we'll be diving each episode into very, very small specifics. We'll go into some episodes will cover a specific house. Some episodes will cover a topic, for example, as Jeff mentioned about London estates or, the maintaining and running of a country house. So do stick with us and come back to us. And we look forward to that. But for now, thank you very much.